The cold seeped into my bones, colder than the February air, colder than the granite marker waiting nearby. It was the kind of cold that felt personal, a physical manifestation of the hollow ache in my chest. The sky was a bruised gray, weeping a fine, relentless drizzle that slicked the black umbrellas and plastered hair to pale faces. My father's casket, draped in a simple floral arrangement he would have found understated, was being lowered into the ground. The sound of the winches was a mechanical sigh, final and unforgiving. My eyes, swollen and raw from crying, were fixed on the dark, rectangular opening in the earth. The minister's voice droned on, comforting platitudes that bounced off the icy air and felt utterly meaningless. Grief was a heavy cloak, suffocating and absolute. My mother, a frail silhouette beside me, clung to my arm, her sobs muffled against her shoulder. Relatives and friends, a sea of black against the muddy ground, stood hushed, heads bowed. It was a tableau of sorrow, a scene etched in shades of gray, and the dull thud of my own broken heart. And then, through the blur of my tears, through the veil of my own profound despair, I saw him. Or rather, I saw the periphery, the ripple of disturbance at the edge of the gathered mourners. A splash of inappropriate color against the somber black, a coat, a scarf, something too bright, too vibrant for this quiet space of loss. And beside him, another figure, equally out of place. My husband, Mark. And Sarah. Sarah. My breath hitched, a painful, ragged gasp. Mark wasn't supposed to be here. He'd said he couldn't make it, a crucial business meeting, impossible to reschedule, something about clients flying in. His absence had been a fresh cut on an already gaping wound, adding neglect to my grief. But here he was, not creeping in respectfully at the back, but standing slightly apart, conspicuous. And Sarah was with him. Sarah from his office. Sarah, whose name had started popping up in hushed whispers, in late-night texts I hadn't meant to see, in a sickening feeling that had been curdling in my gut for months. They weren't even pretending to participate. They stood beneath a shared umbrella, its bright pattern an affront. And Mark. Mark wasn't looking towards the grave. He was looking at Sarah. His hand, instead of being a comforting weight on my shoulder, was reaching into his coat pocket. My mind, already shattered by grief, couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like watching a silent film through frosted glass. The world tilted again, not with sorrow this time, but with a sudden, white-hot disbelief. He pulled something small and dark from his pocket. A box.
No.
Not here.
Not now. Impossible.
He got down on one knee, on the muddy, rain-soaked ground of my father's funeral. The minister's voice faltered, then stopped altogether. A ripple went through the crowd, murmurs like startled birds. Every head turned, not towards the grave, towards Mark and Sarah. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. Her eyes were wide, shining. A look of pure, unadulterated joy bloomed on her face. A smile, impossibly bright, impossibly cruel, spread across her lips. Mark was speaking, his voice too low to carry, but his posture, the way he held the box, the way Sarah was nodding, tears streaming down her face, joyful tears. My own tears froze on my cheeks. The cold was a physical entity now, wrapping its skeletal fingers around my heart and squeezing. My mother's grip tightened painfully on my arm, a small cry escaping her lips as she too understood. The silence of the cemetery, moments before filled only with the quiet sounds of mourning, was now thick with shocked horror. All eyes were on them. All eyes saw him offer the ring. All eyes saw her nod ecstatically. All eyes saw them embrace, a tableau of sickening happiness played out against the backdrop of my father's coffin descending into the earth. At my father's funeral, the ground beneath me felt unstable. The world narrowed to a single, burning point, the sight of my husband, my life partner of 10 years, proposing marriage to his mistress in front of my grieving family and friends, while my father was being buried. The air tasted of mud and betrayal. The only sound was the frantic pounding of blood in my ears, drowning out everything else. This wasn't just infidelity. This was an act of monstrous cruelty, a desecration of sacred ground, a calculated demolition of what little I had left. My father, gone. My marriage, a grotesque, public mockery. My husband, revealing himself to be a stranger capable of unimaginable depths of callousness. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to scream, unable to breathe. The rain continued its steady fall, washing over my face, mixing with the silent, frozen tears that no longer seemed to belong to grief, but to a searing, disbelieving rage. This was the moment everything shattered, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a small velvet box opening in the mud, witnessed by a crowd of mourners. The silence stretched, heavy and damning. Mark and Sarah, oblivious or uncaring, remained locked in their embrace for a moment longer, bathed in the stunned silence of the cemetery. Then, slowly, Mark straightened up, a smirk playing on his lips. He glanced over the crowd, his eyes meeting mine for a fleeting second. There was no apology, no shame, just a flicker of something cold and triumphant before he turned back to Sarah, tucking the box into his pocket. The minister, his face pale, cleared his throat and resumed the service, his voice trembling slightly. But the moment was ruined. The sanctity was violated. The raw, gaping wound of my father's death was now infected with a poison I couldn't comprehend. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, the world spinning violently. My mother's grip kept me upright, her own shock momentarily overriding her grief. I managed to make it through the rest of the service on autopilot, a hollow shell. I don't remember lowering the rose, or the final prayer, or the quiet dispersion of the crowd. I remember the feeling of the rain chilling me to the bone, the muddy hem of my dress, the distant, echoing sound of my mother's whimpers. And I remember the image seared into my mind, Mark, kneeling in the mud, offering a ring to another woman as my father's coffin vanished from sight. It was a picture of hell, framed by gravestones and weeping willows. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. Before that day, before the rain-soaked cemetery and the public spectacle of my husband's betrayal, my life had felt manageable. Ordinary, even. Not perfect, certainly, but built on foundations I believed were solid. My marriage to Mark had been a comfortable routine, 10 years of shared meals, quiet evenings, predictable anniversaries, and the slow accumulation of furniture and joint bank accounts. We were, or so I thought, simply navigating the quiet hum of long-term coupledom. We had our arguments, yes, little spats about finances or chores or his increasing travel for work, but nothing that felt existential. Nothing that felt like this. He worked in finance, a world of numbers and deadlines and late nights. I was a curator at a small, local art gallery, surrounded by beauty and history, a quiet counterpoint to his bustling, often opaque world. We were different, sure, but we complemented each other. Or so I told myself. Looking back now, through the bitter haze of what happened, I see the cracks were always there, just papered over by complacency and the sheer momentum of shared history. His increasing distance, the way his eyes would glaze over when I talked about my day, the subtle shift in his touch, the late nights that started to stretch into early mornings without explanation. I dismissed it as stress, as the pressures of his job, as the inevitable settling of a decade-long relationship. I told myself it was normal. I told myself I was being paranoid. My father, however, was the true anchor in my life. He wasn't just my father. He was my confidant, my mentor, my best friend. He was a man of quiet strength and unwavering integrity. A lawyer by profession, he had a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of justice. He'd lost my mother years ago, a slow decline that had left a permanent ache in his heart, but he'd channeled his energy into his work and, more importantly, into our relationship. We talked almost every day. About everything. About the gallery, about my dreams, about the complexities of the world, about Mark. He had been subtle at first, just a quiet question here and there about Mark's work hours, his stress levels, his commitment to us. Then, more pointedly, after a few times Mark had flaked on family dinners or missed important events, my father had sat me down, his expression serious. He hadn't accused Mark of anything concrete, not then. He had simply spoken about the importance of respect, of presence, of partners supporting each other through thick and thin. He had looked at me with those wise, kind eyes and said, "Don't ever let anyone make you feel small, sweetheart. Don't ever let anyone take more than they give, especially not in a partnership." I had defended Mark, of course. Made excuses. He's stressed, Dad. His job is demanding, Dad. He loves me, Dad. My father had just nodded, a shadow of concern in his eyes. He didn't push. He rarely pushed. He simply observed, offered gentle guidance, and made it clear his door and his heart were always open. He had been ill for a while, a stubborn, insidious disease that crept through his body like a thief in the night. We knew the end was coming, but nothing prepares you for the finality of it. The last few weeks were a blur of hospital rooms, hushed conversations with doctors, and the slow, agonizing farewell. My father, even in his weakened state, had remained himself, calm, clear-eyed, still worrying about me. He'd squeezed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong, and told me he loved me, that he was proud of me, and that I was stronger than I knew. He'd also given me a small, leather-bound journal, his old one from his law school days, filled with his neat handwriting. "For you," he'd rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Little bits and pieces.
Thoughts.
Things you might find useful one day." I had tucked it away, too consumed by grief to look inside. It sat on my bedside table, a tangible link to him that I couldn't bear to open yet. His death had plunged me into a grief so profound, so absolute, that the rest of the world seemed to fade into irrelevance. Mark's distance during this time was palpable. He offered perfunctory condolences, attended the wake for a brief, uncomfortable hour, and then disappeared back into his world of crucial meetings and unavoidable deadlines. His absence at the funeral was the final, brutal confirmation of where I stood in his priorities. It hurt, yes, but it also solidified something in me. A cold resignation that our marriage, whatever it had been, was over. The pain of losing him was a dull ache compared to the fresh, searing wound of losing my father. I was a widow of a sort, grieving not just my father, but the life I thought I had, the man I thought I married. I was adrift, drowning in sorrow and the sickening realization that the person I should have been able to lean on wasn't just absent, but actively indifferent. The funeral, the raw, public humiliation, changed everything. The indifference solidified into something sharper, colder. It wasn't just that he didn't care about me. He actively held contempt for me, for my family, for my grief. To choose that moment, that sacred space, to flaunt his affair and propose it was an act of psychological violence. It was meant to annihilate me, to break me completely in my weakest moment. Standing there, soaked to the bone, watching them embrace, the grief for my father momentarily eclipsed by a blinding, visceral rage, I felt a shift. Something inside me hardened. The shattered pieces didn't just lie there broken. They began to coalesce, not into their original form, but into something new, something sharper, something dangerous. The tears stopped. The shivering wasn't from the cold anymore, but from the intensity of the suppressed fury vibrating through me. The ride home from the cemetery was a blur of silence and my mother's quiet weeping. We dropped her off at her place, arranging for a neighbor to stay with her. She was in shock, her mind unable to reconcile the public spectacle with the solemnity of the day. I promised to check on her later, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. Going back to the house I shared with Mark felt like walking into a crime scene. It was too quiet, too clean. Every object, every photograph of us, felt like a lie. I walked through the rooms, a stranger in my own home, the image of him kneeling in the mud replaying on loop in my mind. The air felt thick with his presence, with the stench of his betrayal, even though he wasn't there. He was probably with her, celebrating. planning their future on the ruins of my past. I sank onto the sofa, still in my damp funeral clothes, and just sat. The silence was deafening. My grief felt distant now, replaced by a cold, analytical anger. How could he?
How dared he?
What kind of person does that? The questions circled in my mind, a relentless, tormenting swarm. He hadn't just cheated. He had planned this public act of humiliation. He had waited for the moment I was most vulnerable, most heartbroken, to deliver the final blow. It was strategic. It was cruel. It was evil. The pain of betrayal was a physical ache, spreading from my chest into my limbs. My fingers trembled. I wanted to scream, to rage, to break things. But a strange calm settled over me instead. A cold, steady resolve. Screaming wouldn't help. Crying wouldn't change anything. What he had done was unforgivable. And it demanded more than just passive suffering. It demanded a response. The immediate aftermath was a strange, surreal limbo. Mark didn't come home that night. Or the next. He sent a text message, brief and chillingly devoid of emotion. Need space. Don't try to contact me. Don't try to contact him? After what he'd done. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. The house was a mausoleum of our failed life. His clothes were still in the closet, his toiletries in the bathroom, his presence lingering like a bad smell. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. My mind was a constant loop of the cemetery scene, interspersed with flashes of our 10 years together, searching for clues, for signs I had missed. And there were so many. The late nights, the guarded phone calls, the sudden trips, the emotional distance that had grown into a chasm. I had been so blind, so trusting, so complacent. Friends and family called, their voices hushed with pity and outrage. They had all seen it, of course. The entire funeral party had witnessed his grotesque proposal. Their condolences for my father were now mixed with horrified commiseration for my marriage. It felt like everyone in town knew. The whispers followed me even in my own home, echoing the public shame. I managed the necessary arrangements for my father's estate in a daze. There were papers to sign, banks to notify, the lawyer to meet with. Mr. Abernathy, my father's longtime partner and friend. A man as meticulous and upright as my father had been. Meeting with him felt like stepping into a different world, a world of logic and procedure, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of my life. I sat across from him in his quiet, book-lined office, the air smelling faintly of old paper and leather. He offered his condolences for my father, his voice genuinely kind. Then, gently, he broached the subject of Mark. He had been at the funeral. He had seen. His expression was one of quiet fury contained behind a professional mask. "I am so deeply sorry, my dear," he said, his voice low. "What Mark did, there are no words." I just nodded, unable to speak. The shame was a hot flush on my skin. "We need to discuss your father's will," he continued, his tone shifting to business, though his eyes remained sympathetic. He was very clear on his wishes. Very specific. My father had been a man who planned for everything. It didn't surprise me. I just nodded again. My father's estate wasn't vast, not by some standards, but he had worked hard his entire life. His house, his savings, his practice, it was substantial enough. Substantial enough, I knew, to be of considerable interest to Mark, now that he was clearly planning to leave me. And that's when the fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of my grief and rage. Mark was a financial man. He knew about assets, about divorce, about splitting things. He would come after my father's money. He would see it as his due, his payout for leaving me. He would try to take what my father had worked for, what he had intended for me. The thought was unbearable. That Mark's monstrous act at the funeral would somehow pave his way to claiming a part of my father's legacy was a twisting knife. "Mr. Abernathy," I heard myself say, my voice trembling slightly. "About the estate, and Mark, does he have any claim?" Mr. Abernathy looked at me steadily. He was silent for a moment, his gaze searching. He saw the fear in my eyes, the raw vulnerability. He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. Your father, he said slowly, was a very wise man. And he loved you very much. He anticipated possibilities. Anticipated possibilities? What did he mean? Had my father suspected something about Mark even before I did? Had he seen through the cracks I had so desperately tried to ignore? The thought sent a jolt through me. My father's quiet questions, his gentle warnings, had he known? Had he tried to prepare me? Mr. Abernathy didn't elaborate further at that moment. He simply said, "The will reading is scheduled for next week. Everyone concerned will be notified and invited to attend, as is customary." Everyone concerned. That meant Mark. And given the public nature of his proposal to Sarah, I had a sickening certainty she would be there too. A fresh wave of dread washed over me. Facing them again, in the sterile, formal setting of a lawyer's office, after the spectacle at the funeral, it felt like another arena for public humiliation. Over the next few days, the dread intensified. Mark remained absent from the house, though I saw his car parked outside Sarah's apartment building a few blocks away. The silence was punctuated by infuriatingly calm texts from him, discussing practical matters as if nothing had happened. He asked about our assets, about the value of the house, about my father's estate. His presumption was staggering. He was already counting his chickens, assuming that my grief and shock had rendered me incapable of defending myself. The pit in my stomach grew deeper. I felt adrift again, helpless. How could I possibly fight him? He had lawyers, he had financial acumen, he had the sheer ruthlessness to do what he did at the funeral. I had grief, and a box of old papers my father had left me. One sleepless night, pacing the empty house, the oppressive silence pressing in on me, my eyes fell on the leather-bound journal my father had given me. I hadn't had the heart to open it until now. Maybe, just maybe, it held some comfort, some last words from him. I sat down at the dining table, the journal cool beneath my trembling fingers. The pages were thin, brittle with age, filled with my father's familiar, elegant script. It wasn't a diary, not exactly. It was a collection of thoughts, legal observations, philosophical musings, sometimes just notes from cases. I turned the pages slowly, my throat tight with emotion. His mind, sharp and clear, laid out before me. Then I found a section marked with a folded corner, dated just a few months ago. Recent. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't law school notes.
This was from now.
The entries were not emotional outpourings. That wasn't his style. They were observations. Cold, analytical, legal observations, but deeply personal nonetheless. He wrote about the nature of trust, about vulnerability, about the importance of protecting oneself, not just legally, but emotionally. He wrote about seeing patterns in people, patterns that repeat, patterns that predict behavior. And then, specific entries. Notes about marital property, about inheritance law, about instruments that could be used to protect assets from unforeseen circumstances. He didn't mention Mark by name in these specific entries, but the timing, the subject matter, the clinical focus on protection from marital claims, it was unmistakable. He had seen it. He had seen the potential for Mark to betray me, to hurt me, to try and take advantage of me. My father, the man of unwavering integrity and foresight, had anticipated this. He had seen the shadow Mark cast and had taken steps to shield me. The entries detailed different legal strategies, discussed nuances of wills and trusts and clauses that could make specific provisions. He was laying out options, outlining defensive tactics. It wasn't a warm, comforting message from beyond the grave. It was a battle plan, written by a lawyer for his daughter, who he knew might one day face an adversary who understood the rules but had no honor. Reading those entries was a turning point. The helpless victim feeling began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning fire in my gut. My father hadn't just grieved my failing marriage, he had prepared for its inevitable, messy collapse.
He had armed me.
Not with weapons of aggression, but with the tools of legal defense, the quiet power of meticulous planning. He hadn't lost faith in me. He had shown faith in me, faith that I would be able to understand, to utilize what he had given me. He had shown me that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it was written in neat script on a brittle page, a quiet whisper across time. The fear didn't vanish completely, but it changed. It became focused. I wasn't afraid of being helpless anymore. I was afraid of not being smart enough to use the tools my father had given me. I was afraid of letting him down. I called Mr. Abernathy the next morning. My voice was different.
Calmer.
More resolute. "Mr. Abernathy," I said, "I've been looking through my father's journal. The one he gave me." There was a pause on the other end. Then his voice carefully neutral. "Ah, yes. The journal. Your father mentioned he had given you something. He wrote about certain legal strategies regarding wills and protection of assets." I hesitated. "Did he discuss these with you? Specifically regarding my situation?" Another pause, longer this time. "Your father and I had many conversations," Mr. Abernathy finally said. "He was thorough in his preparations for the future. For your future. He wanted to ensure you were provided for, no matter what came to pass." He paused again. He gave very specific instructions regarding his will. Instructions that reflected his concerns and his love for you. My heart leaped. This was it. My father hadn't just mused about legal strategies. He had implemented them. Can you tell me anything more?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Not before the formal reading," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "The contents of the will must be read aloud to all parties present. That is the correct procedure. Your father's wishes must be delivered as written, in their entirety, without preamble or interpretation beforehand." He hesitated again. "But I can tell you this, my dear. Your father's will is a testament to his character and his love for you." His words were cryptic, but they filled me with a cautious hope. My father hadn't just given me a roadmap in his journal. He had already charted the course in his will. He had seen Mark's potential for treachery and had built me a shield. The will reading was scheduled for Friday morning. Mr. Abernathy's office. Mark confirmed his attendance via text. "We'll be there. Need to discuss everything." He didn't even have the decency to call. The arrogance was astounding. He truly believed he was entitled to a cut of my father's estate. He saw it as a new pool of money, ready for the taking, especially now that he was discarding me and planning a new life with Sarah. I spent the days leading up to Friday in a state of nervous anticipation. The initial shock and raw grief for my father had settled into a heavy ache, but the fury towards Mark was a live wire humming beneath my skin. I still couldn't eat properly, and sleep was elusive, filled with nightmares of cemeteries and kneeling figures. But beneath the exhaustion and anxiety was a hardening resolve. My father had armed me. I would not go into this meeting as a broken, weeping widow. I would go as his daughter. I reread the entries in his journal. They weren't just legal notes anymore. They were pieces of him, whispering courage across the divide of death. He had been thinking of me, protecting me, even as his own life was fading. The depth of his love felt like a physical presence, bracing me. I chose my outfit carefully for the meeting. Not the black of mourning. Not something weak or vulnerable. I chose a simple, tailored gray suit. Professional. Unassuming. An armor of fabric and structure. I pulled my hair back tightly.
No softegis.
I wanted to project quiet strength, confidence. Not the woman who stood sobbing in the rain. On the morning of the will reading, the sky was clear, a pale, watery blue. It felt like a cruel joke after the relentless drizzle of the funeral. The air was crisp cold. I drove to Mr. Abernathy's office downtown, my hands tight on the steering wheel. I arrived a few minutes early. The receptionist, a kind woman who had known my father for years, smiled sadly and showed me to the conference room. It was a quiet, formal room, dominated by a large polished table and leather chairs. Stacks of files were neatly arranged on a credenza. A carafe of water and some glasses sat on a tray. Mr. Abernathy was already there, waiting for me. He rose as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Good morning, my dear," he said. He seemed to appraise me for a moment, noting my posture, my clothes, the carefully composed expression on my face. A flicker of something, approval, passed through his eyes. "You look strong," he said quietly. It wasn't just a comment on my appearance. It was an acknowledgement. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. I sat down in one of the chairs Mr. Abernathy indicated. The minutes ticked by, each second stretching into an eternity. The tension in the room was palpable, even though I was alone with the lawyer. Then the door opened and they arrived. Mark walked in first, wearing a sharp suit, his expression a mixture of feigned sympathy and thinly veiled impatience. He looked tired around the eyes, but confident, almost swaggering. And behind him, slipping in like a shadow, was Sarah. She wasn't wearing black, but a dark navy dress that looked expensive. She kept her eyes down at first, avoiding my gaze, but her posture was stiff, expectant. She was here as his partner, already staking her claim. Mr. Abernathy's office. The will reading. They had the audacity to come here, together, less than 2 weeks after the funeral debacle. My carefully constructed composure wavered for a second, a hot wave of anger threatening to break through. But I clamped down on it. Not now. Not here. Mark offered a perfunctory nod in my direction, not meeting my eyes. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice neutral. He pulled out a chair, motioning for Sarah to sit beside him. She finally looked up, offering me a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. There was a challenge in her gaze, a possessiveness as she sat beside Mark. I said nothing.
I didn't nod back.
I just looked at them, my expression as neutral and composed as I could make it. They sat across the table from me, a united front of betrayal. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and anticipated conflict. Other people arrived, a cousin, my father's sister, people mentioned in the will for small bequests. They offered me quiet condolences, their eyes flickering towards Mark and Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and condemnation. Mark ignored them, shuffling papers he'd brought, looking important. Sarah fiddled with a ring on her finger. Not that ring, not yet. But I knew it was coming. When everyone was seated, Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat. He sat at the head of the table, a thick file open before him. His expression was calm, professional. He held the room with quiet authority. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice clear and steady. "We are here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Arthur Vance." He went through the formalities, identifying himself, confirming the date of the will, confirming my father's soundness of mind. Mark shifted in his seat, his gaze fixed on the file in front of Mr. Abernathy. He looked like a predator sizing up his prey. Sarah sat beside him, her face pale but watchful. Mr. Abernathy began to read the main provisions of the will. There were specific bequests first. Small amounts of money or personal items left to relatives, friends, former colleagues. As each name was read, the recipient nodded or murmured a quiet thank you. Mark grew visibly impatient during these parts, subtly checking his watch. This wasn't what he was here for. He was waiting for the big picture, for the distribution of the main assets. My father's sister received some antique furniture. A former legal partner, his collection of rare books. A friend, a sum of money for a charity project they had discussed. Mr. Abernathy read each item methodically, his voice even. Then he paused. He turned a page in the file. The atmosphere in the room tightened. This was it.
The core of the estate.
The house. The investments. The substantial assets my father had accumulated over a lifetime. Mark straightened in his chair, his eyes gleaming. Sarah subtly leaned closer to him, her hand resting on his arm. They were ready. Ready to hear how much they stood to gain from my father's death, from my presumed helplessness. Mr. Abernathy looked up for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the faces around the table, lingering on mine for a fraction of a second before returning to the document. He cleared his throat again. Regarding the residue of my estate, he read aloud, his voice clear and resonant in the quiet room, being all property, real and personal, tangible and intangible, wherever situated, not otherwise disposed of by this will. Mark was practically vibrating with anticipation. He was probably calculating percentages in his head already.
Half.
A third? Enough to set them up comfortably, enough to pay for the new life he was planning with Sarah. He probably assumed, legally as my husband, he was entitled to a significant portion, especially with no other direct descendants. Mr. Abernathy continued reading, his pace deliberate. I give, devise, and bequeath the entirety of such residue. He looked up again, his eyes now fixed directly on me. Absolutely and in fee simple, to my beloved daughter, Eleanor Vance. The words hung in the air for a second, then landed like a physical blow.
To me.
The entirety. Absolutely. Silence. A stunned, absolute silence fell over the room. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't dared to hope for this. Not the entirety. Not everything. I had hoped for some protection, some security, maybe the house. But this was everything. Across the table, Mark's face went through a rapid, sickening transformation. The anticipation vanished, replaced by disbelief. His eyes widened, his jaw went slack. He looked utterly blindsided. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and horror. Mr. Abernathy continued reading, his voice betraying not a hint of the drama unfolding. He read the formal closing, the appointment of the executor, which was also me, the instructions for administering the estate. His voice was a steady counterpoint to the silent explosion that had just occurred. Mark sputtered.
What? No.
That's not right. Mr. Abernathy stopped reading and looked calmly at Mark. Mr. Vance, he said, his voice polite but firm. I am reading the exact words as written in Mr. Vance's duly executed last will and testament. The document is clear. But she's my wife. Mark stammered, his voice rising. We're married. I'm her husband. I have rights. He looked from Mr. Abernathy to me, his eyes blazing with sudden, unadulterated rage. The mask was off. Gone was the feigned sympathy, the arrogant confidence. All that remained was the ugly, entitled fury of a man who had just had his expected payday snatched away. Under the terms of this will, Mr. Vance, Mr. Abernathy stated, his voice dropping to a cool, clinical tone, you have no claim whatsoever on the residue of Mr. Vance's estate. The entirety is bequeathed solely and exclusively to his daughter, Eleanor. That's impossible. Mark practically screamed, shoving his chair back violently. It scraped loudly against the floor, the sound jarring in the quiet room. He couldn't do that. That's not legal. As her husband, I'm entitled. Sarah flinched back, looking terrified by his sudden eruption. Mr. Abernathy remained utterly calm. He steepled his fingers on the table. Mr. Vance, he said patiently, your father-in-law was a highly respected attorney. He knew inheritance law intimately. A testator has the right to dispose of their property as they see fit. While spouses often inherit, there is no legal requirement for them to do so, particularly when the primary beneficiary is a direct descendant. Your wife, Eleanor, is the sole beneficiary of the residue of the estate, as is her father's clear and unambiguous wish. But the house, the money, his practice. Mark was on his feet now, leaning over the table, his hands balled into fists. He was red in the face, veins standing out on his neck. He looked less like a sophisticated financier and more like a cornered animal. That's mine. Half of it is mine. We'll be getting a divorce. Marital assets. I'll take everything. His scream echoed in the small room. Sarah was wide-eyed beside him, shrinking away. The other attendees were looking at him with open horror. Mr. Abernathy didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Mark with quiet, professional contempt. Mr. Vance, he said, each word deliberate. While any marital assets accumulated during your marriage will be subject to divorce proceedings, and I highly recommend you seek legal counsel immediately, Mr. Arthur Vance's personal estate is not a marital asset. It is his property, being passed on according to his wishes upon his death. It falls outside the purview of your divorce settlement. Mark stared at him, then at me. The raw disbelief in his eyes was rapidly replaced by a dawning, horrifying comprehension. He understood. He understood that my father, the quiet, kind man he had probably dismissed as irrelevant, had outmaneuvered him completely. My father had seen him, had judged him, and had used the full weight of his legal knowledge to protect me and deny Mark any access to his legacy. He had proposed to his mistress at my father's funeral, a grand, cruel gesture meant to break me and clear the path to a new life, possibly funded by my father's money. He had been so sure of himself, so certain of his entitlement. And my father, even from the grave, had waited for the moment he was most confident, most arrogant, most ready to claim his prize. And then, through the quiet, measured voice of his lawyer, my father had pulled the rug out from under him with absolute, devastating finality. Mark's face contorted, a mask of rage and utter humiliation. He let out another sound, not a scream this time, but a choked, animalistic bellow of frustration and defeat. "And oh," he roared, slamming his fist onto the table. The glasses jumped. He spun around, grabbing Sarah's arm roughly. "We're leaving," he snarled at her, his voice trembling with fury. He didn't look at anyone else. He dragged Sarah, stumbling slightly in her expensive dress, towards the door. As he reached the door, he stopped and turned back to me, his eyes burning with a hatred so intense it made me physically recoil. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You think this changes anything? I'll still make your life hell. I'll fight you for everything else." I met his gaze squarely. The fear was gone now, replaced by a cold, steady calm. I hadn't planned this. My father had. I hadn't orchestrated his downfall. His own cruelty, his own arrogance, had walked him right into the trap my father had laid with meticulous care. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shout back. I simply looked at him, the man who had shared my life for a decade, the man who had betrayed me in the most public, cruel way imaginable. And I saw him, truly saw him, for the first time.
Small, vile, defeated.
A quiet strength settled over me, a legacy from my father, a vindication I hadn't known I craved until this moment. My father's will wasn't just a distribution of assets, it was his final, perfect act of protection, his quiet, devastating rebuttal to Mark's cruelty. He hadn't just left me money and property, he had left me justice. "You already did make my life hell, Mark," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the tense silence. "You did it at my father's funeral. But you didn't break me." I paused, letting my words sink in.
"And now?"
"You have nothing left to take." His face crumpled further, a mixture of rage and impotent fury. Sarah tugged at his arm, pulling him towards the door. He shot me one last look of pure loathing, then turned and stormed out of the room, pulling Sarah along behind him. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing in the sudden quiet. The silence they left behind was heavy, charged with the aftermath of his explosion. The other people in the room shifted uncomfortably, their eyes still wide. Mr. Abernathy calmly reached out and straightened the water glasses Mark's outburst had jostled. He looked at me, a small, almost imperceptible nod of respect on his face. "Your father," he said softly, "was a remarkable man." I couldn't speak for a moment. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving me trembling. But beneath the shaking was a profound sense of release. The weight I had been carrying, the fear of his power, his cruelty, his ability to hurt me further, felt lighter. He had tried to destroy me at my lowest point, and my father, with foresight and love, had ensured that his most devastating weapon, his entitlement, his expectation of gain, would be useless. Mr. Abernathy continued with the reading, detailing the few smaller bequests that remained. The atmosphere was still tense, but the storm had passed. The contrast between Mark's explosive exit and the quiet professionalism of the lawyer, the respectful silence of the others, was stark. It felt like sanity reasserting itself after a brief, ugly intrusion. When the reading was finally finished, Mr. Abernathy closed the file. "Eleanor," he said, turning to me completely now, his tone warm and supportive. "We will handle everything according to your father's instructions. The estate is yours, clear and unencumbered by any claim from your husband, he paused. Your father made provisions. Legal fortresses, if you will. He anticipated this possibility and ensured his legacy and your security were absolutely protected. I managed a weak smile. He told me he'd left some notes in his journal, I said, my voice still a little shaky, about anticipating possibilities. Mr. Abernathy smiled, a genuine, kind smile this time. Indeed. Your father was a man who always looked several steps ahead. He wanted you to be safe, secure, and free. He gestured to the closed file. This is his final gift to you. Not just material wealth, but freedom from financial dependency or threat from someone who proved himself unworthy. Freedom. The word resonated deep within me. Freedom from Mark, from his cruelty, from his entitlement. My father hadn't just saved me from financial ruin, he had bought me my independence. He had seen the chains Mark was forging and had ensured I had the means to break them before they were tightened. The other attendees offered quiet congratulations and condolences as they left, their faces a mixture of sympathy for my situation and perhaps a little awe at the drama they had just witnessed and the quiet power of my father's final act. When only Mr. Abernathy and I remained, the quiet descended again. I sat there, looking at the empty chairs where Mark and Sarah had sat, feeling the absence of my father keenly, but also the strength of his presence in that room, in that will, in the very air around me. What happens now? I asked Mr. Abernathy, the practicalities starting to surface through the emotional tumult. Now, he said, rising and coming around the table to sit beside me, we begin the process of probate. It will take time, but it is straightforward. Your father left everything in impeccable order. You are the executor, with full authority. I will guide you through every step. He looked at me, his expression gentle. And regarding your marriage, you will need to consult with a divorce attorney. I can recommend someone exceptional. But with your father's estate secured, you approach that situation from a position of considerable strength. Mark will have nothing to claim from your inheritance. He will only have access to the assets accumulated during the marriage, and he will find those negotiations significantly less favorable to him than he clearly anticipated. Less favorable. The dry legal term felt like a profound understatement. He had expected a jackpot, a fresh start courtesy of my father's hard work. Instead, he had walked into an empty vault. His arrogance at the funeral, his public declaration of abandoning me, had stripped away any potential legal or moral leverage he might have hoped for. My father's will had ensured his betrayal was financially self-destructive. It wasn't revenge, not in a petty, vindictive sense. It was justice. A cold, precise application of law and foresight that turned the betrayer's weapon back on himself. My father, in his final days, had been thinking of me, protecting me, anticipating the exact kind of person Mark would reveal himself to be. Walking out of Mr. Abernathy's office felt like stepping out into a new world. The sky was still bright. The city felt different, less threatening. The air was crisp, invigorating. I was still grieving my father. That ache would likely never fully go away. The pain of Mark's betrayal would leave scars. But I wasn't broken. I was standing. And I was free. My father had given me so much more than just an inheritance. He had given me validation. He had seen the truth about Mark when I couldn't or wouldn't. He had believed in my strength, even when I felt utterly weak. He had equipped me to not just survive, but to build something new, something stronger, on the solid ground of his legacy. The house, our house, the one filled with the ghost of a failed marriage, was now mine, unequivocally. My father's house, the one filled with memories of love and wisdom, was also mine. His resources were mine, to use as I saw fit, to build the life I wanted, without fear or constraint. Mark tried to contact me later that day. Texts, calls, emails. Furious, demanding, threatening. I didn't answer. Mr. Abernathy had given me the name of the divorce attorney. I made an appointment for the following Monday. I would handle the practicalities calmly, methodically, just as my father would have. The coming weeks were difficult, navigating the divorce, dealing with the emotional fallout, beginning the process of settling my father's estate. Mark was as nasty and litigious as expected, but his bluster lacked foundation. He had no claim on the bulk of the assets. The house he thought we owned equally was now unequivocally mine. His fury was impotent. He had sacrificed everything for Sarah, for a life he expected to build on easy money, only to find himself with nothing but the debts they had accumulated together and the wreckage of a destroyed reputation. Sarah, I heard later, was less than thrilled with his sudden lack of anticipated funds. Their relationship, born of betrayal, was already fracturing under the weight of financial reality. I didn't gloat. There was no joy in his downfall, only a quiet, deep satisfaction in the knowledge that justice, in its own cold, legal way, had been served. My father's love had been a shield, his foresight a weapon. I visited my father's grave again a few weeks later. The ground was no longer muddy. The headstone was in place, simple and dignified, just as he would have wanted. I stood there for a long time, the silence peaceful this time, not heavy with pain. I talked to him, telling him about the will, reading, about Mark's face, about how grateful I was. It felt like he was there listening, a quiet, comforting presence. He had loved me fiercely, protected me fiercely, in life and in death. He had seen the storm coming and had built me an ark. I walked away from the cemetery that day, not just as a grieving daughter, but as a woman who had faced the worst and found strength in the legacy of love and wisdom her father had left her. I had lost him, yes, but I hadn't lost everything. He had made sure of that. And in the quiet, unassailable fact of his will, in the cold, legal reality of Mark's defeat, I found a kind of peace. The rain had stopped. The sky was clear. And I was ready to build my own future, on foundations my father had secured for me, stone by meticulous stone. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.